Hey guys, tonight we travel somewhere that looks, on the surface, like empty desert. Flat land, red rock, endless sky, a lizard sitting on a warm stone, thinking absolutely nothing. And yet beneath that silence, New Mexico hides some of the strangest, most baffling mysteries in all of human history. Things that archaeologists dig up and then stare at for a very long time, without saying anything useful. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy slow walks through ancient places where nobody left a good explanation, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. New Mexico is one of those places that tends to get overlooked unless you are either lost on a highway looking for green chile or deeply interested in things that should not exist but somehow do. It sits in the southwestern corner of the United States, bordered by Colorado, Arizona, Texas, and the general feeling that something strange happened here a long time ago and nobody quite cleaned it up. The landscape shifts from high desert plains to jagged mountain ranges to ancient river valleys, carved slowly over millions of years by water that is now, frankly, mostly gone. What most people do not realize is that New Mexico is one of the most archaeologically rich places on the entire continent, not in a quiet, tidy museum sense. This civilization built enormous stone cities in the middle of nowhere, and then vanished without leaving a forwarding address sense. We have found things buried here that we genuinely cannot explain sense. Please stop casually hiking through this area without paying attention because you might step on something 10 centuries old sense. The mysteries of New Mexico are not small, they are not edge cases, they are not politely debated footnotes in academic journals that nobody reads. They are enormous, strange, sometimes unsettling questions that have sat unanswered for decades, some for centuries, some since the first European explorers arrived and immediately began saying things like, "We are not sure what this is, but we are fairly confident it is impressive." Tonight, we are going to walk through several of those mysteries, slowly, comfortably, in the dark, with no particular urgency, because the ancient ruins are not going anywhere. They have waited this long. They can wait a few more minutes while you find a good position. Let's begin somewhere that has confused archaeologists, architects, astronomers, and anyone who has ever tried to organize a large group project: Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon sits in the northwestern corner of New Mexico. Today it is a remote, windswept place. Getting there involves driving down a dirt road that will make your car quietly question your judgment. There are no nearby towns, no restaurants, no signs suggesting civilization was ever particularly interested in this location. The nearest significant water source is unreliable. The soil is poor, the winters are brutal, the summers are scorching, and yet, between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, people built one of the most sophisticated urban centers in all of pre-Columbian North America, directly in the middle of it. This was Chaco Canyon, home to massive stone buildings, complex road systems, and a level of architectural precision that would be impressive even today. Built by people using stone tools with no metal instruments, no wheeled vehicles, and no written instruction manuals that we have found. Just skill, organization, and apparently an extremely high tolerance for difficult working conditions. The buildings of Chaco Canyon are called great houses. The name sounds modest. The buildings are not modest at all. Pueblo Bonito is the largest and most studied. It once stood 4 to 5 stories tall. It contained roughly 600 to 800 rooms. Its walls were built with a technique that archaeologists call core and veneer construction, where large rough stones formed the core and carefully shaped flat stones were laid in precise patterns on the exterior. The result was walls that were thick, stable, and beautiful in a very deliberate way. These were not walls built by people who were in a hurry. Pueblo Bonito was D-shaped. The curved back wall faced north. The great open plaza faced south. The rooms were arranged in a way that maximized solar access during winter and reduced heat during summer. Doorways were aligned. Walls were plumb. Corners were straight. The entire structure demonstrates a level of planning that required many someones, to think very carefully before a single stone was placed. And here is where the mystery begins. The wood beams used in Chaco Canyon construction did not come from the canyon itself. The canyon had very few large trees. The builders needed ponderosa pine, and they got it by transporting logs from forests 60 to 80 miles away. Thousands of logs, tens of thousands over the course of centuries, carried by hand. Because the Chacan people did not use wheeled carts, they did not have draft animals capable of hauling timber. The logs came on human shoulders across desert terrain in a region where water was scarce and temperatures swung wildly between seasons. Nobody has a fully satisfying explanation for how this was organized on the scale it required. Somebody had to coordinate thousands of workers across a vast region, establish supply chains, maintain construction schedules, and do all of this without written communication in the form we would recognize. Whatever social or political system made this possible, it was sophisticated enough to function across several generations. Because Chaco was not built overnight. The great houses grew slowly over 200 years, room by room, story by story, with careful attention paid to alignment and proportion throughout. The roads are perhaps even stranger. Chaco Canyon was connected to surrounding communities by a network of roads. These were not informal trails worn down by repeated use. They were deliberately engineered. Wide, in some places 30 feet across, remarkably straight, sometimes extending for miles without significant deviation, cut into bedrock in places, bordered by low earthen berms, built with a precision that suggests they were designed to be impressive, not merely functional. The roads connected Chaco to outlying great houses, smaller communities scattered across a region that covered roughly 150 miles in diameter. Archaeologists call this the Chaco system, or the Chaco phenomenon, which is the kind of name researchers use when they are confident something significant is happening, but not entirely sure what to call it. Here is the part that makes the roads particularly strange. Many of them are wider than they needed to be for foot traffic. They are straighter than they needed to be for practical purposes. They continue in straight lines even when terrain makes this difficult, going over hills rather than around them. And in some cases, 2 parallel roads run side by side, with no obvious practical reason for the duplication. This has led some researchers to suggest the roads had a ceremonial or symbolic purpose beyond simple transportation, roads as statements, roads as declarations. We built this, we planned this, we were here, and we were organized. The astronomical alignments of Chaco Canyon add another layer to the mystery. The buildings were not just built with construction quality in mind. They were oriented to track the sun and moon with extraordinary precision. The corners and walls of some great houses align to solstice sunrise and sunset positions. Windows and doorways in specific rooms are positioned to allow precise shafts of light to enter at significant astronomical moments, illuminating specific interior features only at solstice or equinox. On a nearby mesa called Fajada Butte, a petroglyph panel known as the Sun Dagger marks both solstices and equinoxes through the interaction of 2 spiral carvings and 3 stone slabs arranged so that daggers of light cross the spirals precisely on the relevant dates. This was not accidental. Someone understood the movements of the sun and moon well enough to predict them, encode them in architecture and rock art, and build an entire city partly in conversation with the sky. What Chaco Canyon was, exactly, remains debated. It may have been a political center. It may have been a religious pilgrimage destination. It may have been a redistribution hub where goods from across the region were collected, stored, and sent out. It may have been all of these things simultaneously. What it was not was a normal settlement. The population of Chaco Canyon itself appears to have been relatively small for the size of the buildings. Many rooms show little evidence of long-term habitation, no cooking fires, minimal refuse, walls clean and ordered. This suggests many rooms were not lived in the way we usually imagine, but used for storage, ceremony, or the accommodation of seasonal visitors. The great houses may have been built to impress, to receive, to serve as the center of something much larger than itself. A capital city, without permanent residence, an anchor point for a regional network that stretched across hundreds of miles of desert and canyon land. And then, around 1150 AD, it ended. The Chacoan system collapsed. People left. The great houses were not destroyed by invaders. They were not burned. They were simply abandoned, room by room, year by year, until the canyon stood empty. The roads fell quiet. The carefully managed network dissolved. The center, whatever it had been, stopped functioning. A severe and prolonged drought is usually offered as the primary explanation. Tree ring data from the region shows a major drought beginning around 1130 AD, lasting for decades. Water became scarce. Agriculture became impossible to sustain at the scale required. The population dispersed. People moved toward more reliable water sources. The canyon was left to the wind and the lizards. But drought alone does not explain everything. Populations have survived drought before without abandoning sophisticated urban centers. Something about the Chacoan system may have made it particularly fragile. Perhaps the social or political structures that held it together were already weakening before the drought intensified. Perhaps the environmental stress simply finished what had already begun. What remains in Chaco Canyon today are walls. 800 years of walls, still standing in the desert, still precisely aligned, still carrying in their geometry the ambitions and knowledge of people who understood the sky and the seasons and the movement of stone better than most modern observers are comfortable admitting. When civilizations collapse, historians want to know what happened to the people. Chaco Canyon was not small. At its peak, the Chacoan system may have involved or influenced tens of thousands of people across a vast region. When the center emptied, those people went somewhere. The question of where has occupied researchers for more than a century and still does not have a fully clean answer. The most widely accepted view today is that the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, and various Rio Grande Pueblos, are the descendants of people who lived in the Chaco system and the broader Four Corners region. The Pueblo people themselves have never found this particularly mysterious. Their oral traditions describe migrations. Their histories include stories of people moving, stopping, building, moving again. The ancestors are present in those stories. The academic mystery is often more a mystery of documentation than of actual uncertainty. But the physical evidence of that migration is scattered across a landscape that is enormous, and some of it raises questions that oral tradition and archaeological interpretation do not yet fully resolve together. To the south of Chaco Canyon, along the Rio Grande and its tributaries, archaeologists have traced a pattern of population movement that suggests large numbers of people arriving in areas that had previously supported only smaller communities. New architectural traditions appeared, pottery styles shifted, settlement patterns changed. Communities that had been small grew rapidly in the century or two following Chaco's collapse. Some communities show Chacoan architectural influences, the same kind of careful masonry, similar room arrangements, echoes of the planning and precision that characterized the great houses. These were not perfect replicas, but they were not accidents either. They were built by people who knew what Chaco had been, even if they were building something different. Other communities show almost no Chacoan influence at all, as if the people who settled there had come from somewhere else entirely, or had made a deliberate choice to leave their old ways behind. The landscape of post-Chaco New Mexico is a patchwork of continuity and rupture of traditions carried forward and traditions set aside, and archaeologists are still sorting out which is which. Then there is the question of Aztec ruins, not in Mexico, in New Mexico, near the town of Aztec, along the Animas River. The name is a historical mistake made by early Anglo settlers who assumed the ruins must be connected to the Aztec civilization of central Mexico, because they could not imagine any other explanation for large, sophisticated stone buildings in the American Southwest. They were wrong. The ruins at Aztec predate European contact by centuries and have no connection to Aztec Mexico whatsoever. What Aztec ruins actually represents is one of the clearest examples of the Chacoan migration. The site was begun around 1100 AD, at the very end of the Chacoan florescence. Its great house follows Chacoan architectural conventions precisely. Walls built with core and veneer masonry, rooms arranged in an organized pattern, a great kiva, a large ceremonial circular chamber at the center. The building materials, the construction techniques, the spatial organization, all of it echoes Chaco Canyon in ways that can only be explained by direct cultural connection. After a generation or two of Chacoan occupation, Aztec ruins was abandoned, and then, a century later, it was reoccupied by people with a different cultural tradition, one coming from the north and west, from a region archaeologists call the Mesa Verde tradition. These people remodeled rooms, built new structures in a different style, added different pottery, and lived in the great house for another generation before leaving as well. Aztec ruins, in other words, is a building that was built by one culture, abandoned, taken over by a different culture, modified, and then abandoned again, all within about 2 centuries. And it sits along a river connected by road to Chaco Canyon itself, a waypoint in a migration story that is still being read. The broader mystery of Pueblo migration is not simply where people went, it is why certain places were chosen, why certain traditions were kept and others discarded, why the social and political structures of the Chaco system did not reconstitute themselves elsewhere, in recognizable form. The Chacoan phenomenon appears in history once. It does not repeat. Whatever made it possible, whatever combination of environmental conditions, social structures, and organizational genius allowed it to flourish, that combination did not come together again. While Chaco Canyon was reaching its peak in the northwest, something equally remarkable was happening in the southwest corner of what is now New Mexico. Along the Mimbres River in the mountains above the Chihuahuan Desert, a people were painting the finest pottery ever produced in prehistoric North America, and then destroying all of it on purpose. The Mimbres culture flourished from roughly 1000 to 1150 AD. They lived in villages along the river, farming the floodplain, hunting, gathering, trading. They were not a particularly large population. Their villages were modest compared to the great houses of Chaco, but they produced pottery that modern artists, museum curators, and archaeologists have been staring at in varying states of astonishment for more than a century. Mimbres black on white pottery is painted with geometric designs of extraordinary complexity and precision. But more striking than the geometry is the figurative work. Animals painted with a clarity, a sense of movement, and a compositional sophistication that feels entirely contemporary. Fish observed with biological accuracy, insects rendered with scientific precision, rabbits mid-leap, birds in flight, humans engaged in activities that look like scenes from daily life, or perhaps from stories, or perhaps from something in between. What makes the Mimbres artists particularly remarkable is not just their skill. It is their apparent awareness of the picture plane, of composition, of negative space, of how a figure interacts with the circular interior of a bowl. Each bowl is a world. The figure or scene is arranged not to fill the space, but to inhabit it. There is a relationship between the painted subject and the white ground that feels deliberate and considered. This is not decoration, this is art, made by people who thought about art. Some Mimbres bowls depict scenes that researchers have been unable to fully explain. Two figures that may be playing a game, a figure half human and half animal. Scenes that appear to show beings crossing between worlds, or ceremonies we have no other record of, or stories whose context is gone. The images are clear, their meaning is not, and that gap between the clarity of the image and the opacity of its meaning is one of the most frustrating and fascinating qualities of Mimbres art. The destruction of this pottery is what makes the Mimbres mortuary tradition genuinely strange. When a person died, they were buried beneath the floor of the house. This was common practice across the southwest. What was not common was what happened to the bowl placed with the burial. A hole was punched through the bottom of the bowl, a deliberate, carefully placed perforation, and the bowl was placed over the face of the deceased. The bowl was killed, made ceremonially non-functional, released from the world of the living along with the person it accompanied. Every Mimbres bowl found in an archaeological context is killed in this way. The finest examples of the painter's art, the most extraordinary compositions, the most carefully executed figures, all of them perforated, ended. The Mimbres seem to have believed that objects, like people, had a life that could be ended, a spirit that could be freed. Or perhaps they believed that a perfect object should not remain in the world once the person who owned it was gone. Or perhaps something else entirely. The ritual is documented in hundreds of burials. Its meaning remains, in the truest sense, buried. Around 1150 AD, in another of those collapses that pepper New Mexico's archaeological record, the Mimbres culture ended. The painted pottery tradition stopped. The villages were abandoned. The people dispersed into the broader Pueblo world. Their extraordinary artistic tradition, which had flourished for less than 2 centuries, was not continued anywhere in recognizable form. No one knows exactly why the region experienced drought, as did most of the southwest in that period. Resources may have become insufficient for the village populations. Conflict, disease, or social disruption may have played a role. What is clear is that the Mimbres artists left behind thousands of bowls, each one punched through the center, each one a record of someone who died along a river in the mountains of New Mexico 1,000 years ago, and each one a small, precise, unexplained art object that continues to resist full interpretation. In south-central New Mexico, on a basalt ridge rising above the Tularosa Basin, there are approximately 20,000 petroglyphs. 20,000 individual images carved into black volcanic rock by people who lived in this region from roughly 900 to 1400 AD. The carvings cover a stretch of ridge about 4 miles long. On a clear day, you can see the white gypsum dunes of white sands shimmering in the distance. On a windy day, you can feel very clearly why some ancient images here show figures bent slightly forward. The Three Rivers Petroglyph Site is one of the largest and most diverse petroglyph sites in the American Southwest. Unlike some petroglyph locations where images cluster in predictable ways around specific features, the Three Rivers carvings spread across a broad landscape with an almost casual density. Turn over a few rocks in the right area and you have probably found another image. The carvings include animals, both realistic and symbolic, bighorn sheep with curving horns, birds in flight and at rest, fish, remarkable given how far this ridge sits from any significant water, insects, including several that are immediately identifiable as dragonflies, human figures in various postures, faces, masks, or perhaps portals looking out from the rock surface with circular eyes and elaborate surrounding detail, geometric patterns of extraordinary variety, spirals, concentric circles, crosses, star patterns, handprints, figures that appear to be doing something specific but whose activity is no longer readable. And then there are the images that have no clear identification at all, things that do not match known animals, things that might be supernatural beings, things that might be astronomical observations, things that might simply be the personal marks of individual people, the equivalent of a signature or a territorial marker. Things that might be all of these and none of these simultaneously. What the Three Rivers petroglyphs were for is genuinely uncertain. Some researchers believe the ridge served as a ritual or ceremonial location, a place where the act of carving was itself significant, where the image making was connected to specific ceremonies, weather, hunting, fertility, or the marking of seasonal cycles. The number and variety of astronomical symbols, particularly spirals and circles that may represent the sun and moon, supports this interpretation. Others suggest the petroglyphs served as a kind of landscape communication system, marking territories, recording significant events, or conveying information to people traveling through the basin. The ridge is visible from a distance. A person approaching from the flat desert below would see it as a distinctive feature. The carvings, concentrated on its surface, might have served as a signal, a marker, an announcement of presence. Still others, particularly those within Pueblo communities whose ancestors made the carvings, describe the site in terms that neither of the above frameworks fully captures. The carvings are not records or messages in a simple informational sense. They are expressions of relationship between people and land, between the living and the spirits of the place, between the visible world and the world that exists alongside it. This is not a framework that translates neatly into archaeological interpretation, but it is also not a framework that should be dismissed. What is beyond debate is that 20,000 carvings represent a significant investment of time, intention, and attention. Nobody scratched 20,000 images into basalt rock accidentally. Somebody, many somebodies over many generations, considered this ridge important enough to keep returning to it, keep adding to it, keep engaging with the existing images in ways that extended and complicated what had come before. The site grew over centuries, the later carvings placed in conversation with the earlier ones, the ridge accumulating meaning the way places accumulate meaning when people keep caring about them across generations. Today, the site sits in the desert under the open sky, accessible by a trail, documented in photographs and databases, studied by researchers, and still not fully understood. 20,000 images on black rock, and not one of them came with a label. Most people, when they hear the word Roswell in the context of New Mexico mysteries, think of a specific summer in 1947, a rancher named Mac Brazel, a press release that was immediately walked back, and several decades of tabloid speculation. Tonight, we are going to spend very little time on that particular topic and considerably more time on the fact that Roswell, New Mexico, sits in a region with unexplained mysteries that are far older and considerably less photographed than anything that happened in 1947. The Pecos Valley in which Roswell sits was inhabited by Pueblo peoples for centuries before European contact. To the north and west, the Pecos Pueblo itself was one of the most significant communities in the prehistoric Southwest, a trading crossroads between the Pueblo world of the Rio Grande and the plains cultures to the east. The Pecos people traded turquoise, cotton, pottery, and other goods with groups who brought buffalo hides, dried meat, and materials unavailable in the desert interior. Pecos Pueblo was, for a long time, one of the most cosmopolitan places on the continent. a place where very different peoples met and exchanged things. The ruins of Pecos Pueblo sit in the mountains east of Santa Fe. What remains are the foundations of a massive structure that once stood 4 stories tall, with hundreds of rooms housing a population of perhaps 2,000 people. A Spanish mission church was built directly on top of an earlier Pueblo kiva, the circular ceremonial chamber, in a gesture of replacement that the Pecos people apparently found insufficient to actually replace anything. The Pueblo traditions continued alongside and beneath the Spanish colonial presence for generations. The mystery of Pecos Pueblo is not its existence, but its end. By 1838, after surviving Spanish colonization, the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, reconquest, epidemic disease, and decades of Comanche raids that the Spanish colonial government was largely unable to stop, the last surviving residents of Pecos Pueblo abandoned their home. 17 people. The last 17 people of a community that had once numbered in the thousands walked east to Mimbres Pueblo, where their relatives welcomed them. Pecos Pueblo, one of the great centers of prehistoric southwestern life, ended with 17 people walking away. Their descendants are the Mimbres people today. They still hold ceremonies connected to Pecos. They still maintain the relationship with a place their ancestors left nearly 2 centuries ago. The ruins sit in a national monument, the story of those 17 people, the end of something that had lasted for centuries, is one of the quiet catastrophes of southwestern history. But back to the Roswell area, beneath the surface of the Pecos Valley, there are cave systems. The Carlsbad Caverns, lying just south of Roswell in the Guadalupe Mountains, represent one of the largest and most complex cave systems in the world. Over 119 individual caves have been mapped within the Carlsbad Caverns National Park alone. The main cavern contains chambers of extraordinary size, the largest of which, the big room, covers roughly 14 acres of floor space under a ceiling that reaches 255 feet at its highest point. These caves were known to the indigenous peoples of the region for centuries. Pictographs near the natural entrance suggest human presence going back thousands of years. The entrance to the main cavern was used, or at least visited, long before any European arrived in the region. What exactly people did in these caves, what ceremonies they conducted, what they believed about the vast darkness below the desert surface is not fully documented and perhaps not fully knowable. What the caves represent in the broader landscape of New Mexico mysteries is a reminder that the ground itself is stranger than it appears. The desert surface that looks flat and bare and exhausted conceals beneath it a world of extraordinary complexity. Rooms the size of cathedrals, stalactites and stalagmites built over millions of years, underground lakes, ecosystems that function in permanent darkness, and below all of that, probably more chambers that have not yet been mapped. The mysteries of New Mexico are, in many cases, the mysteries of what lies beneath the obvious. One of the most persistent and under-discussed mysteries of New Mexico archaeology is the presence of alignment. Not just the astronomical alignments within individual buildings, like those at Chaco Canyon, but alignments across the landscape, lines that connect sacred sites, mountain peaks, springs, and ruins in patterns that appear deliberate, and that cover distances of tens or hundreds of miles. The Chaco roads we discussed earlier are the most thoroughly documented example, but researchers have found evidence of what might be called landscape geometry in other parts of New Mexico as well. Certain mountain peaks appear to have been significant landmarks, used as reference points for settlement location, for the orientation of buildings, for the arrangement of communities across a valley or basin. The relationships between these points are sometimes precise enough to suggest intentional planning at a regional scale. This is a contentious area of research. Critics argue that with enough sites in a landscape, apparent alignments will occur by chance, and that humans are very good at finding patterns that are not actually there. Defenders argue that the precision of some alignments and the consistency with which certain orientations appear across multiple independent sites exceeds what chance would predict. What is not contentious is that the indigenous peoples of the Southwest understood their landscape in relational terms. Mountains were not just geographical features, they were homes of spirits, boundaries of sacred territories, anchors of cosmological order. Certain directions were associated with certain qualities, colours, animals, and deities. A community's orientation within the landscape was not arbitrary. It was a statement about where the community fit in a larger order that included both the physical and spiritual world. When Pueblo communities positioned their plazas to face specific directions, they were not doing so for aesthetic reasons. When kivas were oriented to align with certain astronomical events, this was not coincidence. The physical arrangement of communities in the landscape was a kind of ongoing prayer, a continuous statement of relationship between the human and the sacred. Whether or not this produced measurable geometric alignments across hundreds of miles is a question researchers continue to argue about. But the intention to live in alignment with a larger order is not in question. The Sandia Mountains, rising dramatically east of Albuquerque, are sacred to the Pueblo people of the Rio Grande. The mountain is called Bien Mur, and it has been significant to human populations in the region for at least 10,000 years. The Paleo-Indian site of Sandia Cave, in a canyon on the western face of the mountains, was once thought to contain evidence of some of the oldest human habitation in North America. The dating of the Sandia Cave materials is still debated, but the cave was clearly used by ancient peoples. What exactly they were doing there, and for how long, and what they understood about the mountain that enclosed them, remains part of the longer mystery of human presence in this landscape. About 60 miles west of Albuquerque, a sandstone mesa rises 365 feet from the surrounding plain. On top of this mesa sits a village. The village is called Acoma Pueblo. It has been continuously inhabited for somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in the United States, possibly the oldest. The people of Acoma call themselves the Sky City for reasons that become obvious the moment you look at where they chose to live. The mesa top is a narrow platform of stone roughly 70 acres, offering extraordinary views in every direction and very few ways up. The traditional route to the top was a hand and foot path carved directly into the cliff face, usable by people who knew the holds and terrifying to everyone else. This was not accidental. A community that places itself on top of a nearly inaccessible mesa and then carefully controls the access routes has thought about defense. The Acoma people have a long memory. Their oral traditions reach back to times before the current village, to earlier homes in the region, to migrations and agreements, and the slow process of finding and naming the right place to live. The mesa was chosen. It was not simply the nearest available high ground, it was the right place, recognized as such through a process of understanding that combined the practical and the sacred in ways that cannot be cleanly separated. The buildings of Acoma are multi-story adobe structures built and rebuilt and modified over centuries. The oldest walls incorporate ancient materials, newer additions reflect later periods, and the gradual incorporation of outside influences. The village is not a museum piece. It is a living community, though many residents now live in the valley below and come to the mesa for ceremonies and during specific times of year. The Spanish built a mission church on the mesa top in the early 17th century. The church required enormous quantities of soil to be carried up from the valley below to create the earth floor and the cemetery. The Acoma people carried it up under duress. The church stands today as a monument to both Spanish colonial ambition and Acoma endurance. The mystery of Acoma is not architectural. It is the mystery of persistence. How does a community maintain its identity, its language, its ceremonies, its relationship with a specific piece of land? Across 1,000 years of climate change, political upheaval, epidemic disease, colonization, forced labor, and every other catastrophe that history reliably provides. The Acoma people have not solved this mystery because it is not the kind of thing that gets solved. It is the kind of thing that gets lived, generation after generation, on top of a mesa above the desert, in a village that has no reason to exist except that the people who live there have always decided it should. In the Gila wilderness of southwestern New Mexico, in a landscape of ponderosa pine and juniper, canyon wrens and golden eagles, and a river that has been carving its way through soft, volcanic tuff for longer than human memory reaches, there is a cliff dwelling, not a ruin visited by thousands of tourists on a paved path. A place that requires a hike to reach, a ford of the river, and a willingness to climb a wooden ladder into a cave 40 feet above the canyon floor. The Gila cliff dwellings were built and occupied from roughly 1280 to 1300 AD, a very short period of habitation, perhaps 40 to 60 years, possibly less. The people who built them were part of what archaeologists call the Mogollon culture, the highland people who occupied the mountains and canyons of southwestern New Mexico and southeastern Arizona for centuries before European contact. The cliff dwellings themselves are built in a series of natural caves in the canyon wall. Approximately 40 rooms, spread across 5 or 6 caves, connected in some places by shared walls or narrow passages. The construction uses the local tuff, a relatively soft volcanic rock that the builders shaped into usable blocks. The walls are not as precise as Chaco masonry. They are more organic, following the contours of the cave, rather than imposing geometric order upon them. The buildings feel as though they grew into the rock, rather than being placed in front of it. Why did the Mogollon people build in the cliffs? The canyon floor below the dwelling site is good agricultural land. The river provides water, the surrounding forest provides game, firewood, building materials and wild plant foods. There was no obvious logistical reason to live 40 feet off the ground rather than on the valley floor. The most commonly offered explanation is defense, that cliff locations offered protection from raiders or rival groups. The period of cliff-dwelling occupation across the southwest, roughly 1200 to 1300 AD, corresponds to a period of significant regional stress, drought, population movement, and increased inter-community conflict. The Gila cliff dwellers left after perhaps 2 generations. The exact reason is not known. They likely joined the broader Pueblo populations to the north and east. Their descendants are part of the Pueblo world today. The caves they left behind sat empty for 6 centuries before European Americans began visiting them in the late 19th century, finding intact wooden beams, fragments of pottery, remnants of woven materials, and in one case, a sandal. A single sandal left on a ledge in a cave in the cliffs above the Gila River, where it sat for 600 years in the dry mountain air until someone climbed up and found it. The sandal is now in a museum. The cave is still there, the ladder still reaches the entrance, and the river still runs below, carrying water that has been running through this canyon since long before anyone climbed up to live above it. In the southern deserts of New Mexico, in the basin between the Sacramento Mountains and the Rio Grande, a branch of the Mogollon people developed an art tradition that has produced one of the most debated images in southwestern archaeology. The Jornada-style petroglyphs and pictographs are found at multiple sites across the region, including the Hueco tank site just across the Texas border, and they depict a figure that researchers have spent considerable time arguing about. The figure is a face. A distinctive face with large circular eyes, a fanged mouth, and elaborate geometric surroundings. It appears in multiple versions across multiple sites, consistently enough to be clearly a cultural tradition rather than individual invention. Some researchers believe this figure represents Tlaloc, the Mesoamerican rain deity associated with water, fertility, and in some contexts, sacrifice. The visual similarities between the Jornada-style masked figure and representations of Tlaloc in central Mexican codices and temples are striking enough that the connection is difficult to dismiss. If the connection is real, it implies a degree of cultural exchange between the desert Southwest and Mesoamerica that is more direct and more significant than the general trade contact usually acknowledged in textbook accounts. It implies that specific religious imagery, specific iconographic conventions associated with particular deities, traveled north from central Mexico into the desert communities of New Mexico and Texas, and were adopted, adapted, and expressed in local stone. The evidence for Mesoamerican connections in the prehistoric Southwest is a subject of ongoing debate. Macaw feathers found at Chaco Canyon came from birds that were almost certainly raised at Pacuime, a major Casas Grandes site in northern Chihuahua, Mexico. Copper bells found in southwestern sites were traded north from Mexican sources. Cacao residue has been identified in ceramic vessels at Pueblo Bonito. These are not the goods of casual accidental contact. They represent sustained trade relationships over long distances. Whether those trade relationships carried not just goods but cosmologies, not just raw materials but religious ideas, is harder to establish. The Jornada masked figure is one of the more compelling pieces of evidence that they did. And if Tlaloc's image was carried north into the New Mexico desert and carved into volcanic rock by people who found it meaningful, then the history of connection between these regions is deeper and stranger, and more interesting than the maps of ancient Mexico and the American Southwest usually suggest. In 2021, researchers announced a discovery at White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico that quietly rewrote the chapter on human arrival in the Americas. Human footprints, fossilized in ancient lake sediment beneath the gypsum dunes, had been dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. This pushed back the accepted timeline of human presence in the Americas by somewhere between 5 and 10,000 years, depending on which model you were using before the footprints arrived. The footprints at White Sands are not a single set, they are many. Hundreds of individual prints preserved in ancient mud that hardened and was eventually buried beneath the gypsum dunes that now define the landscape. The prints include those of adults and children. Some appear to represent people walking, others people running, others people apparently standing in place. Alongside human prints are the prints of animals, giant sloths, mammoths, dire wolves, creatures that lived during the Pleistocene and have been extinct for more than 10,000 years. The dating of the White Sands prints used seeds of a specific aquatic plant found within the sediment layers, seeds that were dated using radiocarbon methods. The dates came back consistently in a range of 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. At that time, the last glacial maximum was underway. The great ice sheets of North America covered much of what is now Canada. The accepted model of human migration into the Americas assumed that people could not have moved south of the ice sheets until the glaciers began retreating, roughly 13,000 years ago at the earliest. The White Sands footprints suggest people were in New Mexico 20,000 years before that mainstream timeline. This is not a small discrepancy. It is the kind of discrepancy that requires one of two responses. Either the dating is wrong, which researchers have examined carefully and continue to find defensible, or the story of human arrival in the Americas is fundamentally different from what was previously accepted. If people were in southern New Mexico 21,000 years ago, they did not get there by walking south through a corridor in the receding ice, because the ice had not yet receded. They must have arrived by another route. The most plausible alternative is a coastal route, people moving along the Pacific coastline, possibly by boat, possibly on foot along ice-free coastal sections, before the glaciers melted and before the modern coastline was established. The evidence for this coastal migration route has been accumulating from other sites, but the White Sands footprints gave it an urgency and a specificity that other evidence had not provided. The people who left those footprints at White Sands walked through a landscape that would have been unrecognizable today. The gypsum dunes did not yet exist. In their place was a vast, shallow lake, Lake Otero, part of a larger pluvial lake system fed by glacial melt and heavy Pleistocene precipitation. The lakeshore supported vegetation. The surrounding landscape supported the megafauna whose prints appear alongside the human ones. The people who walked there were not desert people. They were lakeshore people in a green New Mexico that no longer exists. And they left footprints in the mud, on a warm day or a cool one, in a moment that was entirely ordinary to them, a walk along the shore, a child running ahead, an adult stopping to look at something, and those completely ordinary moments hardened into the mud and survived under the dunes for 20,000 years, and were then found by researchers who spent a great deal of time staring at them and recalculating everything. The White Sands footprints are perhaps the most direct and most human of all New Mexico's ancient mysteries. They do not require interpretation or cultural translation. A footprint is a footprint. Someone put their foot there, a child put their foot there, next to an adult, beside a lake, 21,000 years ago, in a place that is now a white desert of gypsum crystals that crunch softly underfoot. The connection between that child and this moment is 21,000 years long, and it runs through southern New Mexico in a straight, unbroken, fossil-preserved line. We returned, briefly, to roads, because the roads of Chaco Canyon are not the only unexplained road system in New Mexico's ancient history. The broader southwest shows evidence of prehistoric road networks that extended far beyond what Chaco built, and some of these roads connect to places and directions that have not yet been fully mapped or explained. LiDAR, the aerial remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to map ground surfaces through vegetation, has revolutionized the study of ancient landscapes in the Americas over the past decade. Applied to the southwest, LiDAR has revealed road segments, earthworks, and landscape modifications that were invisible or poorly understood from the ground. Some of these features appear to extend the known Chacoan road network significantly. Others appear to be independent systems whose relationship to Chaco is not yet established. The roads raise a question that is easy to state and very difficult to answer. What were they for? Not in the narrow functional sense, because roads carry people and goods, that part is obvious, but in a deeper sense. Why build roads 30 feet wide when foot traffic does not require that width? Why build them perfectly straight when the landscape provides natural routes that would have been easier to follow? Why build parallel roads that run side by side for miles? Why spend the enormous labor required to grade and border these roads when an informal trail would have served the practical purpose equally well? The straightness of the roads is the feature that most challenges practical explanations. Straight lines across complex terrain require significant planning and effort. They do not emerge from repeated use. A road worn by walking follows the path of least resistance. A perfectly straight road is imposed on the landscape. It says, "We are not going around you. We are going through you." And that kind of statement is rarely made for purely practical reasons. Some researchers have proposed that the Chacan roads were processional routes, used for ritual movement between communities, for pilgrimages to and from the canyon center. The width would allow many people to walk side by side in organized groups. The straightness would make the route visible and deliberate. The parallel segments might reflect different directions of travel, or the paths of different groups approaching from different communities, joining the main route as it neared the canyon. If the roads were processional, then Chaco Canyon was a pilgrimage center, a place that drew people from across the region at significant times of year for ceremonies and gatherings whose nature we can only partially reconstruct. The great kivas of Chaco, the enormous circular ceremonial chambers that could hold hundreds of people, would have served this gathering function. The plazas would have been performance spaces. The great houses would have been accommodation and storage for visitors who came long distances and stayed for days or weeks. This interpretation changes Chaco from a city into something more like a cathedral complex, a place not primarily of residence but of convergence, built not to house a population but to receive one. And the roads would be its nave, its approach, its long preparatory journey that began miles away and ended in the canyon where the sky was mapped and the stones were aligned and the ceremonies were conducted that held the whole system together. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the roads were something else. Perhaps our categories, city, cathedral, market, pilgrimage site, are simply inadequate for what Chaco was. The ancient people who built this did not have these categories. They had their own understanding of what they were doing, and that understanding left the canyon with them when they went. One of the things that makes New Mexico's ancient mysteries different from, say, the mysteries of the Maya collapse or the disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization is that in New Mexico, the descendants of the people who made these mysteries are still here. The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, 19 pueblos along the Rio Grande and its tributaries, the Zuni west of Albuquerque, the Hopi in Arizona, are the living continuity of the traditions that built Chaco Canyon and the Mimbres bowls and the Gila cliff dwellings and the Three Rivers petroglyphs. This creates an important and sometimes uncomfortable situation for archaeology. Researchers study the ruins and the artifacts and propose interpretations. The communities whose ancestors made those ruins and artifacts sometimes agree with the interpretations, sometimes they do not. Sometimes the interpretation that makes sense archaeologically conflicts with knowledge held within the community through oral tradition, ceremony, or cultural understanding that was never intended to be public. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 began a legal process by which human remains and cultural objects from museum collections were returned to the communities they came from. This process is ongoing and imperfect. It has returned important things. It has also forced conversations about what research is, what ownership means in the context of cultural heritage, and who gets to decide what questions are worth asking about the past. The mysteries of New Mexico are not simply academic puzzles. They are questions about real people whose descendants are alive today, practicing ceremonies whose origins stretch back to the same people who built Pueblo Bonito and painted Mimbres bowls and left footprints in the mud at White Sands Lake. The living communities are themselves part of the mystery, not because they are mysterious, but because they are present in a world that tends to treat indigenous history as the past rather than the present and future simultaneously. When a Pueblo person says that a particular ruin is connected to their history in a specific way, this is not a claim that needs to be verified against archaeological data to be taken seriously. It is a form of knowledge with its own integrity and its own evidentiary basis. The archaeology and the living tradition are not always in conflict. Often they confirm each other. Sometimes the oral tradition knows things the archaeology has not yet found. And sometimes, in the most interesting cases, they ask slightly different questions and reach answers that cannot be straightforwardly compared, because they are about different things. This is one of the deepest mysteries of New Mexico, not the specific puzzles of roads and pottery and footprints, but the broader question of how knowledge works across time. How does a community carry understanding for 1,000 years without written records, through epidemic and colonization and forced assimilation? How does a ceremony preserve in its structure and its objects and its songs information about events that happened before written history began? And how do we, standing in the present, learn to read what has been preserved without reducing it to data? There is something that happens when you stand in a place like Chaco Canyon or the Gila cliff dwellings or Three Rivers, after the other visitors have moved on and the light has changed and the wind has settled into a low, continuous note. The silence is not empty. It is full of something that is not quite sound and not quite thought. This is not mysticism. It is the ordinary human response to being in a place that has been cared about deeply and continuously by people across a very long stretch of time. Places accumulate something, not literally, not in any physical sense that an instrument could measure, but human attention focused over centuries leaves something in a place, not a ghostly presence, just a quality, a weight, a sense that the ground has been looked at and thought about and named and walked on, and that the walking meant something to the people doing it. New Mexico is full of this quality, perhaps because the landscape is spare enough that nothing is hidden. The ruins sit on the surface. The petroglyphs face you on the rock walls. The footprints, had you known where to look, were always there under the dunes. The evidence of 10,000 years of human attention is distributed across a landscape that does not conceal it with vegetation or development. You drive through this landscape and the past is visible, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, matter-of-fact way. There is a ruin, there is a canyon, there are the marks people left on the walls. The mysteries of New Mexico are, at their core, the mystery of human intention. We can map the buildings and date the pottery and analyze the bone, but we cannot know what it meant to build a road 30 feet wide across a desert, pointing toward a canyon that could be seen from 50 miles away. We cannot know what a painter felt while rendering a fish on the interior of a bowl that would be placed over a dead person's face. We cannot know what a child was thinking when she ran ahead of the adults along a lake shore 21,000 years ago, leaving a line of small prints in the mud that would outlast every civilization that came after her. We can only know that they did these things, that they were here, that they thought this landscape was worth caring about and building in and marking and walking across and returning to across generations, and that their presence distributed across thousands of years and hundreds of sites is legible in the stone and the bone and the painted clay if you look carefully and listen to the people who carry the memory of it still. New Mexico is a landscape of unanswered questions. It will still be a landscape of unanswered questions in another 100 years when the research has continued and the LiDAR has mapped more ground and the conversations between archaeologists and living communities have gone deeper and more honest. The questions will not all be answered, because the most important questions are not the kind that get answered. They are the kind that get refined, generation by generation, into something more precise and more humble and more capable of holding what is actually there. The desert will remain, the ruins will remain, the petroglyphs on their basalt ridge will remain, the footprints, sealed again under the gypsum dunes, will remain, and the road, straight and wide and pointing toward the sky, will remain. Not because nobody has found a way to explain it, but because a road that someone built with that much intention deserves to be thought about for a long time. And on that note, it feels like a good place to let the canyon wine take over. Tonight, we walked through Chaco Canyon and its impossible roads, through the Mimbres River Valley and its punched and painted bowls, across the basalt ridge at Three Rivers, through the caves at Gila, across the ancient lake bed at White Sands, and along the mesa top at Acoma, where people have been living for 1,000 years. We touched the edges of mysteries that have been sitting in the desert since before writing existed in this part of the world, and we came no closer to solving them, which is, honestly, exactly as it should be. If you are still awake, thank you for walking through this with me. If you fell asleep somewhere around Chaco Canyon and the road alignments also, thank you. That was probably the right response. The ruins will be there when you come back. They always have been. Good night.